Welcome to the channel, where the untold stories of power, betrayal, and ambition come to life. If you enjoy gripping, real-life crime stories, hit that subscribe button and join the journey. Don't forget to like and comment below. We want to hear your thoughts. Let's dive into the world of Griselda Blanco. Griselda Blanco's story didn't start in the palatial mansions she would one day own. It began in the unforgiving streets of Cartagena, Colombia, where survival was a daily battle, and the weak never lasted long. She was born into a life of poverty, with a mother who sold her body to make ends meet, and a father who was long gone. Griselda was forced to grow up fast, learning early that the world didn't offer you a place unless you took it. At just 11 years old, Griselda was already hardened by the streets. Her childhood was a blur of danger, with every alleyway and corner holding threats. The first time she felt the coldness of the world wasn't from a stranger or a thief. It was from within her own family. Her mother's neglect and the violence surrounding her made Griselda believe that there was no room for weakness. She wasn't afraid of the men who watched her as she walked the streets, nor the fights she had to get into just to survive. The world had given her nothing, and she had learned to take it. One evening, the world made her choose. A boy, no older than she was, had stolen something, maybe a piece of jewelry, maybe just food, and tried to escape through an alley. He was shaking, begging for mercy, but mercy wasn't something the streets offered. As he turned, his foot caught on a loose brick, and he tumbled. Griselda had been watching the whole time, her eyes cold, her hands steady. She pulled out the knife she had stolen earlier that day and walked up to him. Without hesitation, she lunged. The boy cried out, but Griselda didn't flinch. She was quicker. And just like that, the boy fell silent. She stared down at him, realizing she had done more than just kill a boy. She had taken control. The violence was a part of her now. It was who she was. That night, Griselda walked back to her small, cramped home, not feeling any guilt or remorse, but a strange sense of power. She had taken what she needed, and that would become her motto. If the world wouldn't offer her a way out, she would carve one for herself. Griselda knew she would never go back to being the frightened girl in the alley. She was a survivor. She was a killer. And this was only the beginning. The boy's death became part of her past, buried under layers of ambition and necessity. Griselda never spoke of it, but she never forgot. It was the first step toward a future no one could have predicted, a future where she would rule with fear and calculation. From then on, the streets were no longer just a place she lived, they were a place she would own. By the time Griselda was 12, she was no longer just a girl trying to survive the streets of Cartagena. She had become a force in the city's underground, a shadow moving swiftly through the chaos. It wasn't long before she crossed paths with the city's criminal underworld. They weren't interested in her at first, just another street kid, barely noticed among the many hungry faces in the slums. But Griselda's eyes were sharp, and her instincts even sharper. She was not content with scraps, she wanted more. Her opportunity came one day when a local smuggler, an older man with ties to the growing cocaine trade, made a careless mistake. He trusted Griselda, thinking she was just another young girl in need of a quick deal. She had no family to turn to, and he saw her as a tool, a way to move some product without drawing too much attention. He didn't realize he was handing her the keys to a new world. Griselda watched him carefully, noticing every detail of his operation. The man's downfall came when he trusted her to move his shipment. It wasn't much, just a few kilos of cocaine, but it was enough to get her noticed. Griselda took what she was given, and rather than just delivering it, she took a risk. She didn't deliver it directly to the buyer. Instead, she carefully hid the shipment in a warehouse, contacted a rival dealer, and cut a better deal. She doubled the price, then pocketed the profits. When the man found out, he was furious. But it was too late. Griselda had already moved on, and the word spread fast. She was not to be underestimated. She didn't just steal from him, she outsmarted him. From that moment, Griselda's name began to circulate in Cartagena's criminal circles. She wasn't just a girl. She was a strategist, someone who could see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. Griselda wasn't interested in small-time deals anymore. She wanted to be more than just a middleman. She wanted to control the product, the cocaine that was beginning to flood the streets. She knew that whoever controlled the supply controlled the market. And the more she learned about the growing demand, the more she realized that this was her path to power. She spent the next few years learning the ropes, gaining more trust from the cartels that ran the cocaine trade. She observed how they operated, how they smuggled, how they kept the authorities at bay, and how they eliminated rivals. Griselda's mind worked faster than most, and she saw the weaknesses in the system that others didn't. By the time she was 16, Griselda had become more than just a player in the game. She was a dealer, a distributor, and a strategist, weaving her web across the city. She was no longer a small-time hustler. She was a future queenpin in the making. Her empire in Colombia started small but grew quickly. She used her smarts, her ruthlessness, and a few loyal hands to expand. The more successful she became, the more dangerous she grew. She didn't just want to take over the cocaine trade in Cartagena. She wanted control of everything. She wasn't content with being just another cog in the wheel. Griselda Blanco had bigger plans, and soon, the entire cocaine trade would have to answer to her. Griselda's move to New York was a turning point, a step into a bigger world where the stakes were higher, the competition tougher, and the rewards even greater. By the time she arrived, the cocaine market in the US was just beginning to take off, and Griselda saw an opportunity to expand her empire. She wasn't there to survive, she was there to dominate. The streets of New York were different from the ones she had known in Colombia and Miami. The city pulsed with energy, its underworld teeming with criminals from every corner of the globe. Griselda knew that if she wanted to succeed here, she would need allies, connections she could rely on, at least for a time. That's when she met Carlos, a seasoned trafficker with ties to the Cuban cartel. He was smooth, charming, and had access to the resources Griselda needed to make her mark. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to become her first stepping stone. At first, Griselda played the role of the supporting partner. She worked alongside Carlos, helping him move shipments, learning the ins and outs of New York's illicit market. But from the beginning, she had her own plans. She wasn't interested in sharing power. She was interested in taking it all. Slowly, she began to edge out Carlos, using her wits and her growing network to outmaneuver him. Carlos, for all his experience, didn't see it coming. Griselda's quiet determination was her strength. She let him think they were partners, but every deal, every negotiation, was a lesson for her. She knew exactly how to exploit his weaknesses, the subtle cracks in his operation. It wasn't long before she was controlling the product flow, managing the distribution, and making more money than Carlos ever imagined. The tipping point came when she made a deal with a major distributor behind Carlos's back. She had learned that Carlos wasn't careful with his alliances, and he had been cutting deals with people who weren't trustworthy. Griselda had no such weakness. She trusted no one but herself, and that's why she was able to make the deal go through, quietly and without a hitch. When Carlos found out, he was furious. But Griselda didn't flinch. She had already cut him out of the loop. Their partnership ended as soon as Griselda had enough power. She didn't kill him. She didn't need to. Carlos was pushed out slowly, methodically. Griselda took control of his operations, absorbing them into her growing empire. She had no time for sentimentality. In her world, it was always about the next move, the next deal. Carlos was a means to an end, and now that he had served his purpose, he was no longer useful. He left New York, defeated, while Griselda stood tall as the new queen of the city's cocaine trade. With Carlos out of the picture, Griselda's operation expanded rapidly. She had no illusions about her place in the world. She wasn't just another trafficker trying to make a quick buck. She was building an empire, one that spanned not just New York, but soon, other cities as well. The streets of the city had already begun whispering her name. Griselda Blanco wasn't just a player in the game, she was becoming the game. As the money flowed in, so did the violence. But Griselda wasn't afraid. She knew that power came with a price, and she was willing to pay it. She wasn't interested in being loved. She was interested in being feared and respected. And in the brutal world of cocaine, respect was something you earned with blood and power. Miami was the next logical step for Griselda Blanco. The city was just beginning to heat up with the cocaine trade, and Griselda saw it as a perfect opportunity to expand her empire. She wasn't just looking to move drugs from one place to another, she was here to take control, to own everything. Miami was a new battleground, and Griselda was ready to claim it as hers. At first, the move was subtle. Griselda didn't make a splash, she didn't need to. She knew the key to building power in a new city wasn't about brute force. It was about getting the right people in place, building the network, and quietly eliminating anyone who stood in her way. She moved with precision, spreading her influence through a network of distributors, low-level dealers, and corrupt officials who didn't ask too many questions. Within months, she had established her presence, and soon enough, people began whispering her name. She was the woman to fear, the woman who controlled the flow of cocaine into Miami's streets. But Griselda wasn't just operating on the street level. She was working on the big picture. She wasn't interested in just supplying the drug. She wanted to control the entire supply chain. From the moment she set foot in Miami, she made sure that everyone involved in the cocaine trade, dealers, couriers, even the authorities, knew she was the one calling the shots. She quickly took over the distribution of cocaine, using her connections from New York and Colombia to get the product into the city. And then, like she had done in New York, she started eliminating the competition. Her rise was swift and brutal. She didn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened her operation. Rival traffickers who refused to cooperate or tried to cut into her territory found themselves silenced, sometimes with just a few words, other times with a bullet. Griselda was quick to remind Miami that she wasn't a woman to be crossed. Her reputation for ruthless efficiency spread like wildfire, and soon, the entire city was bowing to her will. But Griselda wasn't just about fear. She was a shrewd businesswoman. She understood the importance of making alliances, especially in a city as chaotic as Miami. She forged relationships with key figures in the police force, local government, and other criminal organizations. She paid off the right people, ensuring that no one would interfere with her plans. She wasn't just making money, she was buying control, piece by piece, until she held all the cards. As her influence spread, Miami became her city. It wasn't just the cocaine trade she was controlling now. She had her hands in everything, from real estate to local businesses. Her empire was built on a foundation of fear, loyalty, and money. She wasn't just another drug queenpin, she was a force. No one moved anything in the city without her say-so, and anyone who tried to defy her found out the hard way what it meant to cross Griselda Blanco. But as powerful as she had become, Griselda knew she couldn't rest on her laurels. Miami was just the beginning. She had bigger plans. She wasn't satisfied with controlling just one city. She was already looking beyond Miami, planning how to take her operation into other markets, how to expand and make her empire even more impenetrable. The power she had accumulated was intoxicating, and Griselda knew there was more to be had. Yet, with all her power, Griselda was aware that there was always someone else watching, someone else waiting to take what she had built. The streets were full of hungry people, eager to rise to the top, and in the world Griselda inhabited, there could only be one queen. She wasn't naive enough to believe she would rule forever. But she was determined to make sure that when the time came, she would leave a legacy of unmatched power, one that would be remembered long after she was gone. By 1975, Griselda Blanco had transformed Miami into her personal kingdom. The cocaine trade that once existed in the shadows was now in full view, with Griselda at the helm. She had built a network that spanned the entire city, connecting dealers, smugglers, and corrupt officials to a system that only she controlled. Griselda's rise to power wasn't just a testament to her ambition, it was a testament to her absolute ruthlessness. In the world she had carved out, there was no room for weakness, and no one was allowed to stand in her way. She wasn't just moving product anymore. Griselda had made sure that every aspect of the operation, distribution, transportation, and even retail, was under her command. She had created a monopoly, one that allowed her to dictate terms to anyone who needed cocaine. Dealers, whether big or small, came to her for the product. Griselda knew that control of the supply meant control of the market, and she made sure that no one could challenge her. Her rivals, though, were beginning to stir. While Griselda had eliminated many of them through sheer violence, a few still remained. They had learned to operate under the radar, and some had begun to work together to try and break Griselda's grip on the city. But Griselda wasn't just controlling the flow of cocaine, she was also controlling the city's pulse. The police, the politicians, even the media were all part of her network. She had built alliances that shielded her from the law, and her bribes ensured that the authorities turned a blind eye to her operations. But even as she cemented her rule, she knew that power was always fragile, especially in a business as dangerous as hers. She took swift action against anyone who threatened her, rivals, traitors, or anyone who stepped out of line. There was always a moment of hesitation from those who thought they could challenge her, but by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. Griselda made sure of that. When her lieutenants reported the smallest hint of betrayal, she responded with swift violence. Her actions were always calculated, and each move she made only reinforced her status as the most feared woman in Miami. But as her empire grew, Griselda's paranoia also grew. She had seen the ruthless nature of the business, the way alliances could shift in the blink of an eye. She couldn't afford to trust anyone, not even those closest to her. She knew the game she was playing, and she knew that in the end, no one was truly loyal. It was a world where betrayal was a constant, and Griselda was always waiting for the next knife to be plunged into her back. Griselda's paranoia manifested in many ways. She had men and women watching her every move, listening for whispers of discontent. She kept the people around her on edge, ensuring they knew the price of disloyalty. But even as she enforced loyalty with fear, she was aware of the price she was paying. The constant tension, the constant watchfulness, was beginning to wear on her. Miami, the city she had conquered, was starting to feel like a prison. Despite the constant threat of betrayal, Griselda had a singular focus: to maintain control. She didn't care about the riches, the fame, or the luxury that came with her position. She cared about power. She wasn't just a drug queenpin, she was a ruler. Every aspect of her life, from the people she trusted to the businesses she ran, was part of a meticulously constructed empire. And if anyone threatened it, they would feel the consequences. But as Griselda surveyed her growing empire, she couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension. The streets of Miami were becoming more dangerous, not just because of her rivals, but because of the cracks that were starting to appear in her operation. The loyalty she had built was fragile, and with each passing day, she felt the weight of her choices pressing on her. The power she had fought for, the empire she had built, was becoming her prison. Griselda Blanco had always been a woman of absolute control, but the growing empire she had built in Miami was starting to feel more like a burden. As her cocaine operation expanded, so did the threats, both from the outside and from within. The power that had once come so easily now felt like something that could slip through her fingers at any moment. Griselda's paranoia, something she had always kept in check, began to gnaw at her more and more. The loyalty of her men, once unquestionable, was now being called into doubt. Whispers of betrayal spread through the ranks, and Griselda could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. Her lieutenants, once trusted allies, were starting to act strangely, disconnected, secretive, as though they were planning something behind her back. She noticed the smallest details, the way they looked at her when they thought she wasn't watching, the way they hesitated before speaking. Everyone was a suspect. Griselda had learned long ago that in her world, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her rise to power had been built on the idea that everyone was replaceable, that loyalty was something to be demanded, not given. She surrounded herself with men who feared her, and while that had worked for years, now it seemed to be falling apart. The men who once feared her were now plotting, or so she suspected. Every conversation felt like a covert meeting, every glance felt like a signal of betrayal. Her closest enforcer, a man she had known since her days in Colombia, seemed to be slipping away. Griselda had always relied on him to handle the more violent aspects of her business. But now, he was distant, no longer returning her calls or answering her summons as quickly as he once had. She didn't need to hear anything more. She already knew he was plotting against her. The weight of her growing paranoia drove Griselda to take extreme measures. She began monitoring her men more closely, installing secret surveillance, and bugging their phones. She demanded reports on every single operation, every deal, and every meeting. She made her enforcers meet in different locations, ensuring they couldn't form alliances outside her watchful eye. She became obsessive. Every detail mattered. Every conversation felt like a potential threat. As the paranoia intensified, so did the violence. Griselda couldn't afford to show weakness. Every time one of her men slipped up or failed to report in, she acted swiftly. There were no second chances. Loyalty was a commodity, and if someone failed her, they would pay the price. The violence became more brutal, more frequent. Griselda had always been ruthless, but now she was slipping into something darker. Her need for control began to consume her. It wasn't just her men she couldn't trust anymore. The law was closing in too. The DA had been watching her for months, gathering information, making connections. Griselda had always been careful. She knew how to cover her tracks, how to stay off the radar. But now, every car that followed her, every unfamiliar face on the street seemed like a threat. The thought of being caught, of losing everything, began to haunt her. Griselda's once impenetrable fortress of power was starting to crack. The more she tried to tighten her grip, the more it slipped through her fingers. She began questioning every decision, every person around her. Were they loyal? Or were they just waiting for the right moment to betray her? Despite her fears, Griselda was determined not to show weakness. She couldn't afford to let anyone see how vulnerable she had become. She maintained her ruthless exterior, projecting strength and confidence to the outside world. But deep down, Griselda knew her empire, her power, was becoming too much to control. The walls she had built around herself were closing in, and it felt like there was no escape. The clock was ticking. Griselda didn't have much time before the cracks in her empire became impossible to ignore. But as always, she had one final plan, one last move. She would take back control, or she would burn it all down. Either way, she wasn't going down without a fight. Griselda's empire in Miami was beginning to show signs of strain. The power she had once held with such confidence now felt more fragile than ever. As the years passed, the Medi cartel, a ruthless Colombian operation, began to set its sights on Miami. They saw Griselda's control over the cocaine trade as a challenge, an obstacle in their path to expand their reach into the U.S. The city, once a battleground of small-time dealers, had become the focal point of a much larger war, and Griselda was at the center of it all. She knew the Medi cartel wasn't just another rival. They were bigger, more organized, and well-connected in ways that Griselda's empire had never been. They had access to more resources, better equipment, and a network of killers that rivaled her own. For the first time in years, Griselda was faced with an enemy she couldn't simply outsmart or eliminate with a few calculated hits. They were coming for her, and they wouldn't stop until they had Miami. Griselda responded the only way she knew how, with calculated violence. She ordered her men to hit back, targeting Medi cartel operatives in the streets, hitting their shipments and destroying their front businesses. But even as she struck back, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was fighting a losing battle. The Medi cartel wasn't just trying to make money, they were trying to destroy her. They had a plan, a long-term strategy, and Griselda knew she couldn't rely on brute force alone. At the same time, Griselda was also feeling the pressure from law enforcement. The DA had been building a case against her for months, and they were closing in. They had informants, wiretaps, and an entire team of agents focused solely on bringing her down. Griselda had evaded the law for years, but she couldn't keep dodging it forever. Every deal she made, every shipment she oversaw, was now being watched. She felt the noose tightening around her, and there was nowhere to hide. The once unbreakable network she had built was starting to crack. The men who had sworn loyalty to her were now questioning her decisions, feeling the heat from law enforcement and their dealings with the Medi cartel. Griselda wasn't just losing her grip on the streets, she was losing her grip on her empire. The fear she had built her empire on was slipping away. Now, it wasn't just fear of Griselda that kept her enemies at bay. It was the threat of the Medi cartel and the law closing in on all sides. As the pressure mounted, Griselda became more isolated than ever. The walls she had carefully constructed around herself were closing in, and the once proud queenpin now found herself questioning every move. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. She had to stay ahead of her enemies, both the law and her rivals, if she wanted to survive. But survival was becoming harder and harder to guarantee. Medi cartel hitmen were everywhere, taking out anyone who stood in their way. And the DA had stepped up its investigation. They were getting closer to making an arrest, and Griselda could feel it in her bones. The drugs, the money, the power, it was all slipping through her fingers. Griselda knew she couldn't win this fight with violence alone. The game had changed. She was no longer just fighting to control the cocaine trade, she was fighting to stay alive. As the Medi cartel closed in from one side and the DA from the other, Griselda knew that if she didn't make her next move carefully, it would be the last one she ever made. The question wasn't whether she could survive, it was whether she could escape the crushing pressure of both her enemies and her own paranoia. Griselda had always thrived on fear, but now that fear was turning inward. She needed to act fast, to make a move that would take her out of the line of fire. But where could she go? Would there even be a place left to hide? As Griselda Blanco faced mounting pressure from the Medi cartel and the ever-watchful eyes of the DA, she was left with only one option: to act. Her empire, once impenetrable and unstoppable, was beginning to crumble under the weight of her paranoia, her rivals, and the relentless pursuit of the law. Every day felt like a battle she couldn't win, but Griselda wasn't one to go down without a fight. She had always been the hunter, never the hunted, and she refused to let that change. Griselda's men became increasingly nervous. The streets were no longer under control. The Medi cartel's operations were growing bolder, and her own people were being picked off one by one. Rival hitmen roamed the streets, carrying out attacks in broad daylight, targeting anyone affiliated with Griselda's empire. Every week brought a new report of a disappearance, a trusted ally found dead, or a shipment intercepted and destroyed. Griselda knew her enemies were out to make a statement. Miami was theirs for the taking. To counter this, Griselda turned to brutality. She unleashed her enforcers in a wave of violence, hitting back at her rivals with relentless force. No one was safe. Rival dealers, cartel members, and even innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire became collateral damage. Griselda's message was clear: if the Medi cartel wanted to take Miami, they would have to step over her first. She was going to make them pay for every inch they tried to take. But even as she fought back, she knew it was only a matter of time before the law caught up to her. The DA's investigation had reached a boiling point. They had tapped phones, bugged meetings, and tracked her every move. They knew too much, and Griselda could feel the noose tightening. Every deal, every shipment, every conversation could be used against her. The evidence was mounting, and Griselda knew it was only a matter of time before they moved in. She had always prided herself on being untouchable, but now the law was breathing down her neck. Every day, Griselda found herself growing more and more paranoid. She couldn't trust anyone, not her men, not the corrupt officials she had in her pocket, and certainly not the women and children she had used to move her product. The network she had spent years building was now her greatest vulnerability. The law knew her empire inside out, and they were closing in on every weak link. Griselda's attempts to cover her tracks became frantic. She shifted operations from one safe house to another, constantly changing her methods of smuggling, using smaller and less visible routes. But the more she tried to hide, the more visible she became. Her paranoia drove her to unnecessary extremes, killing people who had served her for years, anyone she suspected of working with the DA or the rival cartels. Her actions were becoming more impulsive, and Griselda began to feel the weight of her choices. Her men began to question her. The violence was escalating, and the DA was too close for comfort. More than once, Griselda overheard them whispering, wondering if she had lost control. The foundation of loyalty that she had spent years building was beginning to crack. The fear she once wielded with such precision was starting to work against her. Her power was slipping, and the cracks were too big to ignore. As Griselda stared at the walls of her mansion, the walls of her empire, she knew she couldn't fight this war alone. Her enemies had grown too powerful, and the law was too close to striking. Miami was no longer a city she could rule with impunity. It had become a battlefield, and she was losing. In the dead of night, she made her decision. The only way out was to leave. She had to disappear. Miami was no longer hers, and Griselda knew that if she didn't leave, the law, the cartels, or both would bring her down. She called her most trusted men to her, gave them orders to clean up what was left, and started packing her things. Griselda wasn't defeated. She was fleeing, preparing for the next chapter, a new place where she could rebuild her empire. But even as she made plans to leave, a part of her knew the truth. Miami had been her kingdom, and leaving it behind would never be easy. No matter how far she went, the shadows of her past, and her empire, would follow her. Griselda's decision to leave Miami was swift and necessary. But even as she packed the last of her things, readying herself for an escape, something gnawed at her, something she couldn't shake. It was that feeling she'd always tried to suppress, betrayal. After all these years, after everything she'd done to protect her empire, she couldn't ignore the growing sense that even her closest men were starting to waver. Loyalty was a currency, and hers was running thin. The death of one of her trusted lieutenants had been the breaking point. He had been with her from the beginning, through every rise and fall. But now, his body lay cold in a dimly lit alley, a brutal reminder that loyalty could disappear in an instant. Griselda had suspected something was off, but her paranoia had convinced her to overlook it. The betrayal stung. The very men who owed their lives to her were now plotting behind her back. The Medi cartel, law enforcement, and even her own men, everyone was closing in. She stood in the room of her mansion, packing the last of her belongings into a suitcase, when the door opened. It was Pedro, one of her closest enforcers, a man she had trusted implicitly. But his eyes were different today, uneasy, hesitant. Griselda could see the fear in his eyes, the doubt that had settled into his bones. "You can't leave, Griselda," Pedro said, his voice low. "The Medi cartel will hunt you down. The DA is already on your tail. You won't make it out alive." Griselda's eyes narrowed. She knew what he was trying to say. He was afraid of the fallout, of being dragged into the mess she was leaving behind. For a moment, Griselda considered whether he was right. Maybe this was the end. But then, a flash of anger shot through her. She had never been a woman who ran from anything. And she wasn't about to start now. "I'm not running," she said, her voice hardening. "I'm protecting what's mine." But as Pedro continued to talk, Griselda couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He wasn't just concerned for her safety. There was something else, a hesitation in his words that wasn't there before. The trust she had placed in him, in all of them, was starting to feel like a lie. Griselda's mind raced, but she didn't show it. She couldn't afford to. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small revolver, setting it on the table between them. "I'll handle it. I always do." Pedro looked at the gun, then back at her, his expression softening slightly. "You don't have to do this, Griselda. You've built everything. You don't need to keep fighting." For a moment, it almost sounded like he was pleading. But Griselda had no time for hesitation. There was no room for doubt in her world. "You don't understand, Pedro. This isn't about fighting. This is about survival." Her eyes hardened as she stared at him. "You've been with me since the beginning. I trusted you. But trust only gets you so far. If you've made plans with the enemy, if you've turned your back on me, I won't hesitate." Pedro's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Griselda didn't wait for him to finish. She moved quickly, pulling the revolver from the table and firing a shot into the air. The loud crack echoed through the room. Pedro flinched, his eyes wide with shock. "No one betrays me, Pedro," Griselda said coldly, her voice steady. "Not anymore." Pedro's fear deepened, but before he could react, Griselda's men burst into the room, moving quickly, efficiently. The job was done. Pedro, once loyal, now a threat, was neutralized. Just another piece of the puzzle removed to ensure her escape. Griselda didn't feel relief. She didn't feel anything. Her world had always been about loyalty, and now it felt like she was surrounded by enemies. But there was no time to mourn the loss of old allies. The plan was already in motion. The escape was set. The rest of her men had already packed the cars, her escape route prepared. She had set it all up to be quick and clean, no hesitation, no mistakes. Griselda's reputation was too valuable, too dangerous for her to let it slip away. She couldn't afford to let her name go down in history as a fallen queen. As she walked out of the mansion, the weight of her decisions pressed down on her shoulders. She wasn't the same woman who had come to Miami years ago. The fire that had once fueled her every move was now tempered with fear. But Griselda wasn't one to show weakness. Not now. Not ever. She had survived, built, and destroyed. And now, as she prepared to disappear into the shadows, she vowed that this wouldn't be the end. The world would remember the name Griselda Blanco. She had made sure of that. Griselda Blanco's final departure from Miami was swift and silent. The city she had once ruled with an iron fist now felt like a distant memory, a place she had conquered but could no longer call home. She knew the DA was just a few steps behind her, that the Medi cartel would never stop hunting her, and that even her closest allies had betrayed her. But even as the weight of her empire crumbled around her, Griselda refused to be a victim. She had built everything she had with her own hands, and she wouldn't let it slip away without a fight. The night was her cover. The streets of Miami, once full of her influence, now felt unfamiliar and cold. Griselda's trusted men had prepared her escape, and she had already slipped through the cracks of the city, leaving behind the life she had built. Her mansion, the very place where she had dreamed of ruling the drug empire from, was now a ghost, and the people she had once trusted were either dead or scattered. Griselda didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Her route was mapped out carefully. A small plane was waiting for her in a secluded airstrip just outside the city. There was no time for grand goodbyes or last-minute mistakes. The life she had once held was fading into the night, and in its place, she was stepping into an uncertain future. But as always, she kept control. Control was all she had left. Griselda had planned for this moment for years. She had learned from her past mistakes, and had set up a network of contacts that spanned the world. If Miami was no longer hers, there were other cities, other markets, where she could rebuild. She was a survivor. She had learned to never leave a trace, to never give anyone a chance to take what was hers. No one knew where she was going, not even her closest men. Griselda couldn't afford to trust anyone now. The plane took off quietly, and as the city's lights disappeared behind her, Griselda allowed herself one final breath of relief. It wasn't over. The world had not seen the last of her. Miami would remember her, and so would the people who once feared her. She would always be a queen, even if it was in the shadows. Her empire may have fallen, but the legend of Griselda Blanco would never die. Days turned into weeks, and Griselda settled in a small, quiet town far from the life she had known. She wasn't sure what her future held, but one thing was certain: she would never stop moving. Never stop fighting. Her name might be a whisper in the streets of Miami, but it would live on, not as a criminal, but as the woman who had once controlled the flow of cocaine across an entire city. Griselda Blanco was a force, and forces, no matter how long they've been in hiding, never fade. And as she sat alone in her new home, far from the empire she had once ruled, Griselda smiled quietly. She had built an empire from nothing, controlled the streets, and changed the course of the cocaine trade forever. The world may have forgotten her face, but they would never forget the name. Griselda Blanco had lived on her own terms, and that was all that mattered now. Thanks for watching. If you found this story captivating, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible tales from the world of crime and power. Share your thoughts below. We love reading your feedback. Until next time, stay tuned for more stories that reveal the rise and fall of legends.